Hello and welcome to the Geek Battle Gaming YouTube channel. In today's discussion, we're going to start looking at some of the weird versions of Street Fighter 2 that exist. And there are a bunch of them, but on today's, we're going to start to deep dive into the Sega Master System game. Street Fighter 2 is one of the most famous games and most beloved games of all time. It's just one of those games everyone knows, and probably a large percentage of the population of the planet Earth have played. Now, it came out in 1991 at the arcades, and since that time it has been released on every platform under the sun, or almost. But whilst it may be a loved game, and it's great that Capcom did make it available on most platforms, not all of them are quite equal, not by a long shot. In today's discussion, we're going to start to look at the weird versions of Street Fighter 2, starting with the Sega Master System version, and in later videos we will look at other platforms and what they got. Basically, ever since home and handheld consoles overtook the power of the original arcade machine, the versions have all been fairly faithful to the arcade game. The fun era of weird Street Fighter 2 versions came in the early days, where Capcom was determined to get it running on systems that were not really capable. The Master System version is a valiant effort to bring the game to Sega's 8-bit console, but considering that their 16-bit Mega Drive version wasn't arcade perfect, as pretty damn good as it is, don't all jump on me in the comments, the Sega Master System version is something of a demake. Due to hardware limitations, the game just doesn't quite cut the mustard compared to the arcade version. There is no version which is more interesting than perhaps the Sega Master System game. Released in 1997 and only in Brazil, the game is both a huge achievement in many ways, and also a sign of why it was the game that justified the transition from 8-bit to 16-bit consoles, as it clearly lagged behind its 16-bit brothers. After the arcade game of Street Fighter 2 was ported to the Super Nintendo, the game had received multiple upgraded editions. This included Street Fighter 2 Turbo and Championship editions, which allowed you to play as the 4 boss characters, and also added speed to turbo up the gameplay. Super Street Fighter 2 added an additional 4 fighters, bringing the roster up to 16. And in the years that followed, there was Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which added Akuma as the true final boss, and more variants like the Game Boy Advance Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo Revival, and the HD remaster of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, and the Nintendo Switch Ultra Street Fighter 2 The Final Challenges, which added Violent Ken and Evil Ryu. Whilst all of these added new things along the way bit by bit and were in some way an upgrade, the Master System game was a version of the 1991 game, and it was released in 1997, at which time the Street Fighter series had already moved on to the Street Fighter Alpha/Zero sub-series, and was also taking steps to go 3D with the Street Fighter X Plus Alpha game on the PS1. With all the new Street Fighter games out there at the time, it was weird for a game to get a downgrade on old hardware. Now, to be clear, yes, there was a Game Boy game that released in the time frame of the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive games, and you could argue that was a demake, but like any 16-bit game that found its way to the Game Boy or the Game Gear, it was a version based on what was possible, but it was a handheld system, so a contemporary arcade game or console game on a contemporary handheld had to be something of a downgrade. The Sega Master System game is a slightly different story. It was a game that was only made to keep interest alive in the Sega Master System whilst the console was still a big deal in Brazil, a long time after the Master System was no longer a big deal or relevant in anywhere else in the rest of the world. Now, because of the strange history of video games in Brazil as a market, the video game industry out there isn't the same as it is in pretty much everywhere else in the rest of the world. It was not typical for Japanese or American consoles like those from Nintendo, Sega or Atari to get a release in Brazil. As many will know, the Brazilian toy company Tectoy licensed the Master System in Brazil so it could officially release the hardware and games in the region, and there were a number of Brazil-exclusive Master System games as a result. Now, whilst piracy was huge in the region, the Master System version of Street Fighter II would have still been the only official way many players out there would have got the opportunity to play the famous arcade game for many years. So, now it is time to break down the good and the bad of the Master System port, as although it is very, very so impressive, it is also arguably one of the worst versions of the game ever released. The game features a bunch of cut content. There are only 8 fighters instead of 12 of the original. They are Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, Blanka, and Guile of the standard fighters, meaning that E-Honda, Dalsim and Zangief have all been cut. Of the bosses, Vega is cut, but the rest of Balrog, Sagat and Bison are still all present. One cool thing is all of the bosses are selectable to play as from the beginning, which with this version just being titled Street Fighter II and not as Championship Edition or Turbo, you may not have expected them to be playable at all. But then again, with the other characters being cut, they kind of needed to be playable just so you'd have characters to play as. Now, it is also of note that other than the opening credit screen, which I believe to be in the Portuguese language, the rest of the game is presented in English. Or, well, at least it is in the version of the game I played. So it's also of note that the bosses are named what they are in the English language speaking versions of the game. For those who don't know, in the Japanese game, the boxer character wasn't called Balrog, but was called Bison, which was clearly based on Mike Tyson. Now, for some reason, when it came to the States, Capcom decided to swap the names about, so the boxer became Balrog or Balrog, and this was the original name of the character we in the West call Vega. Vega was originally the name of the dictator character we call Bison. And of course, Vega was originally Balrog. And why they just didn't swap the two characters or just change just the boxer's name to Steve Hardpunch is anyone's guess. The Master System version has no screens after you beat or are beaten by an opponent to say the famous lines like defeating Xing Long or crushing people or such like. There are also no endings for individual characters, with just one screen to show that you beat the game. And it's an odd screen which just shows the 3 main bosses, and their artwork is a little funky here. Another omission is that the game doesn't show you a little box with a star or victory sign in it to indicate how many rounds have been won. So you just have to guess. So if you've won one and your opponent won one, and you're not sure was that a previous attempt, you just have to guess. Right, well anyway, the sound is pretty good in the game for the hardware, and the iconic tunes are there and in decent form, but they're not as great as they would be on the Super Nintendo. There is a bunch of announcer voice samples, but no vocal samples from the characters themselves. So none of the iconic Sonic Boom or Hadouken. I probably mispronounced that anyway, and that's a shame. In terms of presentation, to begin with, let's start with how good the graphics are for the game. For the Master System, the characters are reasonably big on screen. They're also really quite good in that they look like the characters in the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive versions of the game, but as if when you'd grab a JPEG and stretch it down in something like Microsoft Paint, how it would lose so much resolution. Kind of looks like that's what they've done. Now, it is worth remembering that the game is a much later release than most Master System games, and so therefore developers would have had the full benefit of learning how to squeeze every last drop of power out of the aging hardware. Now, I truly do mean it when I say that many people would look at a screenshot of the Master System game and may not instantly know it's perhaps not from the Mega Drive or the Super Nintendo. The problem is when you see it in motion. There is very little in way of animation compared to the arcade version of the game. It's not unplayable, but they clearly stripped back the animation to the absolute limit of what they could get away with. The stages the game takes place on are likewise bare bones versions of the arcade original. The backgrounds look better in still images than they do in motion though, as they're not at all animated. Ken Stage by far looks the worst as it's just boring looking. And you can tell that often the stages are just mirrored. The boat on Ken Stage literally has the word Capcom printed in reverse on the left hand side of the screen. So let's take a little bit of a deep dive into each of the stages. Okay, so here we can see the Ken stage from both the arcade original and the Master System version, and you can see that it is probably the least impressive on the game. You can see that there is a boat in the background on the Master System version and it says Capcom. Well, you may be able to read that, but it is reversed because not every stage I don't think, but certainly on the Ken stage and a couple of others, the background is just mirrored. So you do see it saying Capcom the correct way, the other side of the screen. But just looking at it here, you literally have no people, just a boat. It's not even that much of an impressive boat compared to the other one. It does have a USA flag, but otherwise it is just green swamp water with a green sky. And yeah, it's probably the least impressive of all of the background stages on the game. Also, you'll be able to note here how the shadows just kind of float underneath the characters, especially when they get knocked to the ground. So now we'll see a comparison of the Chun-Li stage, and this is one of the more detailed and impressive on the Master System version, just because it's got all of the stuff hanging down from the shops. It has some people there with chickens. The guy in the middle always reminds me of Steve Irwin, because he's going like, "Oh, crikey, mate," or something like that. I don't know. But you'll see it doesn't again have any animation compared to what you get on the arcade original, and there's nowhere near as much detail, but that there is stuff going on regardless. So it's still visually interesting and it is recognizable, certainly in screenshots, just as being the Chun-Li stage. So the Ryu stage does look pretty good for a Master System game. There's like a load of detail in there, but when you compare it to the original, it just doesn't have the most interesting stuff. It doesn't have the building in the background, it doesn't have that sloping roof, or I don't even know what that thing is that's originally in the game. I think it's just a part of a roof, but it almost kind of looks like a giant cannon. At least that's what I always thought it was when I was very young. But anyway, this looks pretty good, but a bit bare bones. The Blanka stage is actually kind of blank. Now, the boards and the details on them, because it's on some sort of marshland and then you just get like the wooden planks and that, they look alright, and there are a couple of huts. But the fact that they didn't have the iconic snake coiled around the tree, that to me is the biggest letdown of this design. Okay, so here we see the Guile stage, and on the arcade original there's like the fighter pilots and the fighter plane, and there's a couple of people, and again they are mirrored on this stage. So the guy with the girl is mirrored, the foreground isn't mirrored I don't think, or maybe it is, the star might just be mirrored in the middle. Actually, looking at it, the star is mirrored in the middle because it doesn't have the central top pointy bit. And you do get this fencing, which is a little bit more forwards than the other objects in the background, like the people. But why is it at night? Why is there just this orange sky? It's kind of a depressing looking stage on the Master System version, whereas on the arcade version it's like blue skies. It looks, you know, proper happy sunny day kind of visuals. Now, this is by far the least appealing looking stage on the Master System version. So the Balrog stage does have where it says Las Vegas along the front, and that isn't mirrored because it is literally just words. But then the background, you get one guy in the middle, and then you get what looks like faces, like anguish and tortured souls in the background, and it's pretty horrific looking. I don't know if that's meant to be like a crowd at a boxing thing, but they look terrible. Now, when you look at the arcade original, you do see a row of people at the very back, and they're the only things kind of represented here. So maybe they just don't have much more to their arcade original artwork, and they didn't bother to fill it in with anything new. Hence why there's just like a black void of nothingness around these people bathed in red light. So this one is kind of disappointing because the most famous thing about the Sagat stage is the big statue laying on its side. Now, in the background, when I first played the Master System version, I just thought, why are there Christmas trees here? And of course, these are just green versions of the temples or whatever the buildings are in the background of the arcade original, but they just look like Christmas trees to me. So this one is a bit disappointing, but it's not the worst one in the game. At least they've kept it set during the day. The last stage in the game is the Bison one, which again, this makes it set at night, which for a final boss is no bad thing. Again, I think it may be mirrored, and they've kept a reasonable amount of the detail of the surroundings, but there are no people here, which in one sense adds a bit more drama to it. So in this instance, you could say that the Master System one, in certain ways, may even be an improvement on the original. I mean, obviously it's not an improvement in any way, it looks terrible compared to the original, but just putting it at night and having it more secluded does add a bit more of a dramatic element to it. The characters do feature shadows underneath them, but there is a strange sense of them floating above their own shadows, which I feel could have easily been avoided, but I'm sure there's some technical reason for why they left it the way they did. This looks worst when a defeated opponent just lays above their shadow. The game doesn't start with a cutscene of two guys fighting in front of a tower, and the menu to select the characters doesn't show a map, and the character artwork on the selection screen is based off the look of the characters from Super Street Fighter 2, rather than the original. When it comes to gameplay, the biggest difference is that the Master System only has two buttons and a D-pad. So you get one punch button and one kick button, and that's your lot. It's not even like the Mega Drive version where if you didn't have a 6-button controller, you could switch between A, B and C buttons being light, medium and heavy kicks to being light, medium and heavy punches by pressing the start button. The Master System had a start button, well, a pause button, but unlike the Mega Drive start button, it was located on the console itself rather than on the controller. The lack of buttons means a significant compromise in terms of gameplay and strategy. Fortunately, pulling off special moves in Street Fighter 2 wasn't dependent on hitting a particular strength. So it's not like you had to hit heavy punch to be able to pull off a dragon punch. Now, here's the thing though. Whether you hit light or heavy, you could still shoot off a fireball as Ryu. What you lose is how powerful each move can be. A heavy punch would do a heavier hit. Now, I found special moves very tricky to pull off at times, even though I consider that I've been able to pull off a hurricane kick and fireballs easy as pie for 30 years now on pretty much every other version of the game. And when I say pretty much, we'll explore that in a later video. Each character only has 2 special moves, so literally there is no Dragon Punch on the game for Ryu and Ken, which is a big loss in this version. Blanka's Electricity is the easiest special move to pull off, as it is just mashing the punch button. Likewise, Chun-Li's kick is very simple. But no 1,100 hand slap whatever it was from E Honda, as like we said earlier, he's not in the game. Chun-Li does have her fireball, which is interesting as I don't believe she actually had it in the earliest version of Street Fighter 2, and it was added in later games. This again shows this isn't strictly a conversion of the original Street Fighter 2, and is in fact a watered down version of Super Street Fighter 2. The game can be challenging on hard, and stupidly easy on easy. You can often win just by altering punch and kick and getting in close to repeatedly hit your opponent. Street Fighter 2 for the Sega Master System is far from perfect, but it is still fun for a while and a better version than anyone could have realistically expected to be released on the old Sega hardware. But this is but one of the weird versions of Street Fighter 2 that exists. Whilst the SNES and Mega Drive and even PC Engine versions of the game have been re-released on virtual consoles over the years, generally speaking, the only version that gets released these days are versions of the arcade originals. There are still more weird versions with unique quirks that we need to deep dive into, but we'll leave those for another day. So that's going to wrap things up for this video. We are going to have a bunch more of these in the coming days, weeks and months that are going to look at the many weird versions of Street Fighter 2 that exist. So make sure, if you haven't done so already, that you smash that subscribe button, hit it with a fireball and all that jazz, and do check out the rest of the content on the channel. So if you want to read the written review, or written article version of this I should say, do check out www.xstreamed.tv, and with that, until next time, stay safe, always stay extremed, and ciao for now. Boom! And we're off the air.